Before I knew who I was, I had already learned how to stay silent. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I believed silence would keep me safe. I shrank myself into the smallest version I could manage. I laughed when I wanted to cry. I nodded when I wanted to run. I pretended to crush on people I didn't love, and swallowed jokes that sliced through me. I called it survival. But truthfully, I was slowly disappearing. Then one day, I read a single sentence that stopped me in my tracks. Your silence will not protect you. Audre Lorde. I read it again, and then I cried, because somehow this black lesbian poet from another generation had written the sentence I didn't know I needed. She gave language to the ache I had buried, and in that moment I realized, speaking my truth might terrify me, but staying silent was quietly destroying me. That was the day the journey began, the journey of being LGBTQ, and learning not just to survive, but to live, unafraid. I think I always knew I was different, not in a dramatic spotlighted kind of way, but in the quiet moments, the ones no one else notices, like the way my heart would jump when I saw someone I couldn't admit I liked, the way I froze when others spoke so casually of love, as if love only came in one shape, one story, one kind of body. I was young when I learned the rules, not from a book, not even from a direct scolding, but from the invisible script handed to every child. Be normal. Be quiet. Be small. And so I became a master of shrinking. I studied people the way others studied math. What to laugh at. When to nod. Which pronouns to use when talking about my future. How to smile without revealing the ache behind my teeth. I watched other boys chase girls across playgrounds, boasting about crushes they didn't understand yet, and I mimicked their game. I picked a name, any girl, and made her my cardboard crush. And I carried that mask so well. Even I began to forget what my real face looked like. But the truth had a pulse. And every time I tried to smother it, it throbbed louder. Still I kept performing. Because the alternative, being found out, felt like death. At school, I flinched at slurs thrown like spitballs across classrooms. Words like fag and queer weren't just insults. They were warnings. They meant, stay in line. Or else. I heard those words and filed them under. Who I must never become. I didn't know yet that those words would one day become sacred, would one day become mine, would one day become something I could say, without flinching. But back then they were landmines, and I tiptoed through my days, desperate not to explode. Even at home the silence was thick. Not hateful, not cruel, just uninterested. The kind of silence that doesn't ask, doesn't suspect, doesn't know how to hold a truth like mine. So I told myself, maybe this part of me is better left unnamed. Maybe if I don't say it, it won't be real. Maybe if I push it deep enough, it'll go away. Maybe silence really is safety. I was a child, and children believe things when the world says them loud enough. And the world kept saying, you're not what we want. You're not right. You're a glitch, a threat, an embarrassment. So I learned not just to hide, but to vanish. I became background. I became agreeable. I became invisible. In every space where visibility could be dangerous. And yet, even in the vanishing, there was a part of me that never stopped glowing. A sliver of soul that refused to be extinguished. I didn't have the words for it then, but it was waiting. Like a page unopened. Like a poem unsaid. Like a voice I hadn't found yet, but that had already begun whispering back. A voice that sounded something like truth. Something like defiance. Something like, you were not made to disappear. But I didn't know how to believe that yet. I only knew how to survive. And to survive, I thought, meant staying small. There is a strange kind of pain in knowing who you are, but being too afraid to live it out loud. That was my daily reality for years. A quiet ache that followed me into every room, every friendship, every mirror. I could laugh, I could perform, I could say all the right things, and yet there was always a part of me folded away, like a letter I didn't dare open. Being LGBTQ in a world that preferred silence felt like carrying a truth that could burn everything down. So I kept it hidden, not because I was ashamed, but because I wasn't sure the world would let me survive it. I became an expert at compartmentalizing. There was the version of me I showed to the world, friendly, polite, agreeable. And then there was the version I only met at night, when I closed my eyes and let the masks fall away. In the dark, I could admit who I loved. I could whisper names I wasn't allowed to say in daylight. I could imagine a life where I didn't have to lie. And then I'd wake up and put my armor back on. Some days I convinced myself it wasn't so bad. I told myself I was strong for carrying it alone. I told myself I was protecting my family, my future, my dignity. I told myself that maybe someday I'd come out when the world was kinder, when I was older, when I was braver. But those days turned into years. And the longer I waited, the heavier it became. Because hiding doesn't just protect you from pain. It also locks you out of joy. You don't just hide your fears. You hide your laughter, your softness, your freedom. And I began to wonder. If I couldn't love openly, was I really loving at all? I watched others around me move through life so easily. Holding hands in public, posting pictures without fear, talking about crushes and heartbreaks like it was nothing. I envied them. But I also feared what they had. Because with visibility comes risk. And I had trained myself to avoid risk at all costs. I became so good at hiding I forgot what it felt like to hope. There were moments, though unexpected flashes, when I felt the truth rising in me. A queer friend laughing too loudly and not caring who stared. A pride flag waving in someone's window like a quiet rebellion. A line from a poem that cracked something open in me. And sometimes I'd wonder, what would it feel like to live that free? What would it cost me? I didn't know how to answer that. But I knew this. Disappearing was not as safe as I had imagined. Because in the process of making myself smaller, I was slowly erasing the most beautiful parts of me. I was surviving, yes, but I was not alive. And that's the thing no one tells you. You can live for years in survival mode, and it will look like strength. You'll get praise for your self-control. You'll be admired for how together you are. But underneath that surface, your heart is whispering a question you're too scared to face. Is this the life I was meant to live? Or just the one I settled for because I was afraid? That's the question that haunted me. Not every day, but often enough. And it's the question that brought me back to Audre Lorde. Because somewhere in her words, her rage, her fire, her clarity, I started to see a mirror. Not a perfect one, not a finished one, but a reflection that said, you don't have to disappear to be safe. You don't have to silence yourself to survive. There is another way. And maybe, just maybe, I could find it. Didn't happen like in the movies. No dramatic music, no spotlight, no instant transformation. It was quieter than that, like a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding finally being released. I was sitting alone in a library, thumbing through books I didn't know I needed. I was looking for distraction, maybe even escape, but what I found was a doorway. Her name was printed in bold at the top of a page, Audre Lorde, and I remember pausing, not because I knew who she was, but because something in that name felt solid, like it had weight, like it had been waiting for me. I started to read. Slowly at first. Then faster. Then slower again, because I didn't want the words to end. She didn't write like anyone I had ever read before. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't smooth her edges to be more acceptable. She didn't explain herself. She simply declared, I am deliberate and afraid of nothing. And something inside me stirred. There was no pretending in her writing. No apology. No coded language. She spoke of being a Black lesbian mother. A woman who had been told her entire life that her voice was too loud, her love too wrong, her anger too much. And instead of hiding it, she carved it into poetry and essays and speeches and fire. Every sentence was a rebellion. Every paragraph was a homecoming. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a question mark. I felt like a sentence that had just found its ending. The line that stopped me cold, the one that still echoes, was this: your silence will not protect you. I read it over and over like a prayer and a warning. Because somewhere deep down I had been hoping that maybe if I stayed quiet enough, careful enough, invisible enough, I could stay safe. But Audre Lorde looked right through that lie. And she said it plainly. Silence will not save you. It will not shield you. It will only shrink you. And it had already shrunk me so far I barely recognized myself. That night I went home and searched her name. I read her biography. I watched her interviews, her voice rich and steady, like someone who had walked through fire and come back with poems in her hands. She spoke with such clarity, such purpose, as if every word had to count, because her existence was political before it was ever poetic. She didn't just write about being queer. She wrote about the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, class. She didn't separate them because the world didn't separate them for her. And neither did it for me. Reading her was like discovering a map, not out of the pain but through it. She wasn't offering a shortcut to peace. She was offering truth. And it burned beautifully. I didn't come out that night. I didn't suddenly find all the answers. But I did something even more important. I stopped pretending I wasn't there. I stopped lying to myself that the pain would pass if I just stayed quiet. I acknowledged the silence. And then I began to question it. Audre Lorde became my anchor in a storm I didn't yet know how to survive. Her words were not gentle, but they were kind. They didn't promise comfort. They promised clarity. And sometimes that's the first step. Sometimes, before you find your own voice, you need to hear someone else name the things you thought no one could see. That's what she gave me. A mirror I didn't expect. A vocabulary for emotions I had buried so deeply I forgot they were mine. In her defiance, I saw possibility. In her refusal to disappear, I saw an invitation to finally show up. And maybe that's where every journey begins. Not in knowing who you are completely, but in recognizing that someone somewhere has walked through the same fire and left behind a path of words to follow. The shift didn't come all at once. It was quiet, almost hesitant, like testing a door you've always believed was locked. For a while, I still carried Audre Lorde's words in silence, like a secret I wasn't sure how to honor. But something had changed. The silence no longer felt safe. Felt like a betrayal. Not just to myself but to her, to everyone who had spoken truth when it was dangerous to do so. If she could say it out loud in a world far more hostile, how could I justify continuing to hide? The first time I told someone, my voice almost broke in half. It wasn't a dramatic confession, not a grand declaration. It was over coffee with someone I trusted. A friend who'd always sensed something but never pushed. I don't remember the exact words I used. I just remember how terrified I was, and how soft her response was. She didn't flinch. She didn't pity me. She just said, "Thank you for telling me." And for the first time, the truth didn't echo in an empty room. It landed. It was held. After that, it got a little easier. I told another friend. Then my sister. I started writing differently, more honestly. I stopped changing pronouns in poems just to make them palatable. I let my queerness breathe on the page. I stopped deleting tweets that felt too revealing. I started showing up in ways I hadn't dared before. Not loud, not radical, but real. And real was revolutionary enough for me. Of course, there was still fear. Coming out isn't a one-time event. It's 1,000 tiny decisions every day. To correct someone's assumption, to risk a look, to speak when silence would be easier. But with each act of truth, something inside me expanded. Like lungs filling after years of shallow breath. Like a room I didn't know I was living in finally being lit. And it wasn't just about telling others. It was about telling myself. Looking in the mirror and saying it without shame. Holding my own gaze and refusing to look away. Letting the word queer sit in my mouth without apology. I started to claim it, not as a confession but as a gift. A perspective. A power. There's something sacred about naming yourself on your own terms. It's not about what the world thinks. It's about declaring to yourself, "This is who I am. I am not broken. I am not less. I am not sorry." I started reading Audre Lorde's work out loud. Not to anyone else, just to myself. Her poems became mantras. Her essays became armor. There was one line I returned to often. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. I repeated it when I felt small. I repeated it when I walked into rooms unsure if I'd be welcomed. I repeated it when I felt the pull to disappear again. Because I knew now. Speaking my truth wasn't selfish. It wasn't dramatic. It was necessary. Every time I chose to be visible, I wasn't just doing it for myself. I was honoring the ones who came before me, who had no choice but silence. I was carving space for me, for the next person, for the one still afraid. This shift, this slow, sacred undoing of fear, didn't erase all the pain, but it gave the pain a purpose, turned it into a story I could tell in full sentences, not just coded metaphors, a story that no longer lived only in my chest, but now had room to breathe in the world. And once I started speaking, even softly, I realized something I never expected. I wasn't alone. There were others, so many others, who had been waiting to hear someone say out loud what they had only dared to feel in secret. And that, more than anything, is what gave me strength. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do isn't to shout. It's to speak. Just speak. Truthfully. Even when your voice shakes. Especially when it does. There's a moment, and I don't know exactly when it happened, where I stopped feeling like a burden and started realizing I was a miracle. Not in a dramatic or self-righteous way, but in the quiet, steady recognition that I had survived something the world said I shouldn't. I had survived 1,000 tiny deaths. Every time I bit my tongue, every time I laughed at a joke meant to erase me, every time I chose silence over authenticity. And yet somehow I was still here. Still whole. Still burning. I used to think that being queer meant being broken. That there was something inherently fractured in me, something I needed to fix or hide or soften to be acceptable. But now I understand what Audre Lorde meant when she wrote that our silence won't protect us, and neither will our compliance. I realized I was never broken. I was always burning. The world just didn't know what to do with someone who refused to go out. And there's something powerful that happens when you stop apologizing for your fire. You stop dimming your light to comfort the room. You stop editing your story to make it easier to hear. You stop asking for permission to exist. You simply do. You walk into a space and let your presence be a declaration. I am here. I am queer. I am not afraid. I began to understand my identity not as a flaw, but as a lens. A way of seeing the world that is rich, complicated, nuanced, and deeply human. Being LGBTQ has taught me how to live at the intersections, how to hold contradictions, how to love in spite of history and hope in spite of fear. And no one taught me that more than Audre Lorde. She showed me that being queer is not just about who you love. It's about how you fight, how you speak, how you care, how you refuse to be erased. Her words reminded me that survival is not just personal. It's political. Every time we choose to show up in our full selves, we're doing something revolutionary. And that revolution isn't loud. It's not always waving flags or marching down streets. Sometimes it looks like choosing joy. Sometimes it looks like telling your story. Sometimes it looks like refusing to let shame dictate the shape of your life. I look at myself now not with perfection, not with arrogance, but with deep-rooted pride. I am the queer fire they tried to extinguish. The flame they told me would ruin everything. My career, my family, my faith, my worth. And yet, here I am. Not ruined. Not lost. Not silenced. Lit from the inside out. It took me years to understand that my queerness was not an obstacle. It was my origin story. The reason I feel deeply. The reason I write. The reason I fight for truth, for justice, for beauty in places others overlook. My queerness taught me how to be brave in the face of absence. How to build home inside myself. How to see others the way I needed to be seen. Audre Lorde once said, "When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid." I carry that with me. Not because I am fearless. I'm not. But because I've learned that fear doesn't have the final word. Fire does. And I am fire. I used to think my story was just for me. That it was private, small, something to carry quietly through life like a folded letter never meant to be opened. But something changes when you start living in your truth. The world begins to respond subtly at first, then unmistakably. People begin to notice your presence not as a shadow, but as a signal. And slowly, almost without trying, you find yourself becoming the voice you once needed. I remember the first time someone reached out to me. A message in the middle of the night, simple, trembling, typed slowly by fingers unsure if they'd regret sending it. "Hey, I saw what you posted. I'm not out yet. But thank you. I feel a little less alone." And I sat there staring at the screen stunned. Not because I had done something extraordinary, but because I had simply told the truth, and that somehow had created space for someone else to breathe. That's the ripple effect. It doesn't always feel dramatic. Feels like connection. Like a hand extended in the dark. Like a mirror offered gently saying, "Look, you're still beautiful." Audre Lorde did that for me. And now, unknowingly, I was doing that for someone else. I started to write more. Not with the urgency of proving anything, but with the calm knowing that my words might land where they're needed most. I stopped editing out my queerness from my stories. I let it take center stage. Not to perform but to be present. I let the poems hold my real pronouns. I let the metaphors stay messy and human. I let my softness show. And slowly people came. A coworker who pulled me aside to say, "I'm figuring it out too." A cousin who whispered, "I think I might be like you." A stranger online who said, "You said what I couldn't." I never gave them answers. I just gave them room. Because sometimes the most healing thing isn't advice. It's witnessing. And I had been witnessed once long ago by a woman named Audre Lorde. A woman who would never know my name, but who carved out a place for me before I even knew I needed it. Her voice lives in mine now. Not in the way I speak, but in the courage underneath it. In the way I refuse to shrink. In the way I ask better questions. In the way I make space for contradiction, for complexity, for the kind of love that doesn't fit inside boxes. She taught me that being queer wasn't just about identity, it was about vision. A way of seeing the world through a lens sharpened by pain, colored by joy, and committed to justice. And so, when I speak, when I write, when I walk into a room without apology, I carry her with me. Not as a quote, not as a symbol, but as a quiet rhythm in my voice, a fire in my language, a legacy that says, "We are not here to be tolerated. We are here to be luminous." Audre lit the match. I keep it burning. And someone else, someone watching, listening, trembling, will catch the spark and carry it forward. That's the truth they never told us. Being yourself isn't selfish. It's sacred. Because every time you choose to live honestly, you give someone else permission to do the same. And that changes everything. If Audre Lorde were here, sitting across from you, eyes steady, voice low but unmistakably firm, I don't think she'd try to fix you. She wouldn't give you a 10-step plan to feel brave or a perfect sentence to come out with. She wouldn't sugarcoat the truth. She never did. But she also wouldn't let you leave unchanged. She'd probably begin with silence, the good kind. The kind that holds space, not hides it. She'd look at you until the noise in your head quiets. Then maybe she'd say something like this: "You already know who you are. The question is, are you willing to live like it?" Because she wouldn't talk to your fear. She'd talk to the part of you beneath the fear. The part that's still glowing. The part that hasn't forgotten. She'd remind you that your queerness is not a liability. It's an inheritance. That the softness you've been taught to fear is actually your sharpest weapon. That joy in a world that tries to make you ashamed is an act of rebellion. That when you speak, even with a trembling voice, you are continuing a conversation started by people who didn't survive just for themselves, but for you. She would say, "Your silence will not protect you, but your truth might." She'd remind you that being LGBTQ is not a problem to solve. It's a perspective to honor. It is a richness, one the world needs, even if it doesn't always understand it, especially then. And if you're tired, if you've been carrying too much for too long, she wouldn't shame you. She'd nod, because she knew the weight too. But she'd also say, "You're not just surviving, you're sowing." Every word you speak, every truth you claim, every time you refuse to shrink, you're planting something. And one day, someone will rest in the shade of your courage. So if you're wondering whether you're ready to live as yourself, to speak as yourself, to love as yourself, maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the question is, are you willing to stop betraying the part of you that already knows you're enough? Because you are. You've always been enough. Even in silence. Even in fear. Even in the moments you thought you lost your voice, it was still there waiting. And now maybe, just maybe, it's time to use it. Audre Lorde isn't gone. She's in every word that burns for truth. She's in your breath when you dare to speak. And when you do, even in the smallest whisper, she echoes in you.